3 weeks before Russia launched its most anticipated offensive of 2026, Ukraine quietly destroyed the conditions that made it possible, not with a dramatic strike on Russian headquarters, not with a long-range missile into Moscow, with a whitelist, a verified registry of authorized satellite terminals sent by Ukraine's defense minister to a private American technology company in California. And when that company enforced it, the entire communications architecture that Russia's frontline forces had been secretly depending on collapsed simultaneously across more than 1,000 kilometers of front. That is where this story begins. But to understand why it matters, you need to understand what Ukraine did next in the silence that followed. Let's go back to the beginning. February 28, 2026, Operation Epic Fury opened the front in a way that changed the entire calculus of the war. But 700 kilometers south and west of that operation's epicenter, something else was happening, something that military analysts are now calling one of the most consequential sequences of events in the entire 3-year conflict. First, the unit, the 76th Guards Air Assault Division. This is the formation that entered Belarus in March 2022 with the mission of seizing Hostomel Airport in the opening hours of the full-scale invasion, the plan that was supposed to open the door to Kyiv in 72 hours. This is the unit that Ukraine's forensic teams later documented committing war crimes in residential neighborhoods outside the capital. It is not simply an elite formation in the bureaucratic sense. It is Russia's premier rapid reaction ground force, the unit the Kremlin deploys when something breaks and nothing else will fix it. By 2025, after 3 years of continuous attrition, the 76th had been ground down to the point where it was operating 70-year-old T-55 tanks salvaged from long-term storage. A Forbes analysis from April 2025 documented something almost surreal. Paratroopers from the 76th attacking Ukrainian positions near the Russian border in Kursk Oblast while riding electric scooters. That is not a metaphor. That is what degradation looks like at the end of 4 years of the most attritional land war since Korea, and yet Moscow still reached for this unit when it needed results. In November 2025, elements of the 76th, along with its constituent 104th, 234th, and 237th VDV regiments, were redeployed to the Pokrovsk direction, Russia's premier offensive axis in Donetsk. The fall of Pokrovsk and Myrnograd in January 2026 had been achieved at staggering cost but had failed to produce the operational breakthrough the Kremlin had been promising for months. The 76th was sent in to restart momentum on the most important offensive sector on the entire front. That chip was pulled off the table in late January 2026, not by a Russian decision, by Ukraine. Here is what Ukraine did and how precisely it executed it. In late January and early February 2026, Ukrainian forces launched what their official communications described as limited stabilization operations on the Huliapol and Orikhiv axes in Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk oblasts. The language was deliberately modest. The reality was not. Ukrainian forces attacked on at least 9 vectors simultaneously. The 24th Separate Mechanized Brigade, equipped with American Bradley M2A2 infantry fighting vehicles and Swedish CV-90s, pushed along the Anyuriva River corridor into the Russian rear. Ukrainian air assault troops cleared Russian positions north of Huliapol. Special operations teams infiltrated along river lines. The result, Russia lost in 7 days everything it had taken in 60. Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky confirmed on February 23 that Ukraine had liberated 400 square kilometers and 8 settlements since late January. By early April, that figure had grown to 480 square kilometers and 12 settlements. February 2026 became the first month since 2023 in which Ukraine regained more territory than it lost across the entire front, and then came the ISWAL report using data from March 6th and 7th, describing the knock-on effect in clinical but devastating language. The Russian military command had laterally redeployed elements of the 76th VDV division, the same formation, sent to Pokrovsk to restart the stalled Donetsk offensive, to the Orikhiv direction in Zaporizhia to plug the gap Ukraine had torn open. The 40th Naval Infantry Brigade from the Pacific Fleet, another formation deployed only in genuine emergencies, was pulled from the Dobrylia tactical area and sent to the Huliapol direction. Elements of the newly formed 55th Naval Infantry Division, also Pacific Fleet, were sent to the Palahi area south of Huliapol. The 68th Army Corps, including its 39th Motorized Rifle Brigade and 1,472nd Motorized Rifle Regiment, was pulled from near Prakhovsk and Dobrylia in Donetsk Oblast and redirected south. ISU's assessment stated the conclusion directly. Ukraine's counterattacks in February-May 2026 have disrupted Russia's plans to continue exploiting tactical successes in Zaporizhia Oblast and may have generated spoiling effects for the anticipated spring-summer 2026 offensive against Ukraine's fortress belt. Iran designed a strategic trap intended to divide Western attention, drain American resources, and reduce support for Ukraine. Instead, it produced the opposite: a depth of collaboration between the United States and Ukraine that neither could have built without the exact pressures Iran created. That is not a minor miscalculation. That is a trap that snapped shut on the party that built it. To understand why the outcome is as consequential as it is, you first need to understand what the trap was, what it was supposed to achieve, and why Iranian planners believed it would work. The core strategic insight driving Iran's approach was a reading of Western political vulnerability that was, in isolation, not unreasonable. Iranian planners had spent years studying the Ukraine conflict, the coalition supporting Kyiv, and the domestic pressures operating on Western governments. What they concluded was that support for Ukraine was politically contingent, that it rested on a coalition of governments facing competing domestic priorities, economic pressures, escalation fears, and public opinion constraints that could be pushed past a breaking point if those governments were forced to manage a second simultaneous crisis elsewhere. The crisis Iran designed to create that pressure was built around the Strait of Hormuz and a coordinated escalation across multiple Middle Eastern theaters at the same time. Houthi maritime operations targeting Red Sea shipping, Iraqi militia attacks on American military forces, Hezbollah operations on Israel's northern border, direct Iranian nuclear signaling generating crisis atmosphere. The combination was designed to force the American national security establishment into a resource allocation dilemma. With finite attention, finite military capacity, and finite political bandwidth, a sufficiently severe Middle Eastern emergency would reduce the priority and the sustainable commitment to the Ukrainian theater. The historical logic behind this approach was genuine. American strategic attention has been diverted by Middle Eastern crises repeatedly across decades. Iranian planners who had spent careers analyzing American foreign policy behavior had reasonable grounds for expecting that pattern to repeat. The trap was not designed carelessly. It was built on a real understanding of American institutional tendencies and real political vulnerabilities in the Western coalition, and then it backfired. The first dimension of the backfire was what happened inside American strategic decision-making when the simultaneous pressures materialized. Instead of triggering the resource competition and priority diversion Iranian planners had modeled, the combination of simultaneous crises across multiple theaters produced a different response: the recognition, arrived at with the specific clarity that concentrated crisis sometimes generates, that the multiple pressures were not independent problems requiring independent solutions, but a coordinated campaign by a connected adversary coalition requiring a connected strategic answer. The American assessment that consolidated around this recognition was that Iran, Russia, and their network of aligned partners constituted a sufficiently integrated threat that responding to each component separately was less effective and ultimately more costly than building an integrated response architecture that addressed the connected nature of the problem. That assessment removed the political constraints that had previously limited the depth of American engagement with Ukraine. The institutional hesitations, the escalation caution, the specific political guardrails that had kept the bilateral defense relationship from reaching its most ambitious potential were swept aside by a strategic situation in which the cost of maintaining those constraints had become undeniably higher than the cost of removing them. Iran's trap created the political conditions for exactly the collaboration it was designed to prevent. The second dimension of the backfire is more technically specific but equally consequential. Iran's proxy campaign deployed Iranian military technology across multiple operational environments simultaneously. Shah drones supplied to Russia for use against Ukrainian cities, anti-ship systems deployed by Houthi forces against Red Sea shipping, electronic warfare and guidance systems provided through proxy networks to militia organizations across the region. Each deployment served Iranian strategic purposes. Each deployment also created something Iranian planners had not fully accounted for: a real-world testing environment that generated operational knowledge directly applicable to Ukraine. American defense technology development has always confronted the gap between laboratory performance and battlefield reality. No testing program fully replicates the electronic environment, the countermeasure pressure, and the operational conditions of actual combat. Iran's proxy campaign eliminated that gap by deploying Iranian origin systems against American and allied forces across multiple active theaters at scale. The specific performance characteristics of Iranian drone designs against American countermeasures in the Red Sea, the electronic signatures and flight profiles of Shah variants against Ukrainian air defenses, the precise vulnerabilities of Iranian navigation and guidance systems to the jamming and electronic warfare approaches being deployed against them. All of this flowed into the American and Ukrainian defense development pipeline as validated operational data that no laboratory program could have produced. Iran provided Russia with drone technology. That same technology was deployed against American defended interests in the Middle East. American forces engaged it operationally, learned its specific vulnerabilities at a depth that only real combat against large numbers of those systems can generate. And that knowledge was integrated into Ukrainian air defense through the collaboration that Iran's pressure had created. The weapon Iran gave Russia is now better understood by the defense it faces than it would be if Iran had never deployed it elsewhere. That is the backfire in its most technically precise form. The third dimension connects the first two and explains the specific product that the collaboration has generated. Ukraine and the United States have built an integrated multi-domain strike and defense architecture whose individual components existed before, but whose integration, the coordination protocols, the data sharing arrangements, the operational concepts that convert separate capabilities into a unified system is genuinely new and genuinely unprecedented in the history of the bilateral relationship. The targeting integration element is the most immediately visible in its battlefield effects. American intelligence collection satellite imagery, signals intelligence, electronic order of battle data, real-time information about Russian positions and movements and vulnerabilities is being integrated with Ukrainian strike systems through data links and operational protocols that are the direct product of the collaboration. Iran's trap catalyzed. Ukrainian precision strike systems are now being applied against targets whose identification and vulnerability assessment reflects American intelligence at a depth and speed that Ukrainian national collection could not independently achieve. Each strike is more effective than either partner operating alone could produce. The electronic warfare integration is the element most directly traceable to the Iranian proxy campaign. American electronic warfare systems whose capabilities were refined against Iranian-origin threats in the Middle Eastern theater are integrated with Ukrainian air defense infrastructure in ways that give Ukrainian forces a specific advantage against Russian use of Iranian-supplied systems. The Shahd drone that Iran designed, manufactured, and provided to Russia is the same design that American systems spent months engaging operationally in another theater. That engagement produced intimate knowledge of its navigation frequencies, its guidance architecture, its specific susceptibility to particular countermeasures. That knowledge, now embedded in the collaboration architecture, converts what was supposed to be Iranian support for Russia into a vulnerability for Russia.